Hello everyone, we are starting the main webinar right now, and as usual my moderator Oz is here. Hello Oz.
Hello Lada.
How are you?
Doing well, thank you.
Okay, terrific. So we will jump straight into the main body of the webinar, and the first topic we will discuss, which will be crucial for the understanding of everything that is going on today and will be happening in the next several years, and the topic is the real role and the real truth about the USSR. Let me give you a preview of what I'm going to talk about and how everything connects. In order to truly understand the entire premise of this webinar, you have to listen carefully to this primer about the USSR. For the very first time, you will hear a multidimensional account of the truth. We will go well beyond 3D, third-dimensional reality, which is a physical reality we all live in. Refer back to my Earthshift primer for more about 3D, 4D, 5D, and multidimensional universe. Due to the fact that the vast majority of people, and regretfully all the so-called experts, are stuck in third dimension and are unable to see things beyond the tip of their nose, is because they're truly unable to understand the true reasons for the earth-shifting events we're experiencing. The most you'll get from them is that I feel that blah, 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 or no one can predict what will happen and when. I think that such and such scenarios are possible, but don't hold me to it. And the timing of events is especially well beyond the scope of their understanding. So listen carefully, as what you'll hear below will be new to most people. In the end of this part, I'll drop the bomb on you. I'll tell you the real reason the appearance and existence of the USSR was necessary and unavoidable. I'll tell you the real reason the USSR became unnecessary at one point, and the true reason it had to fall apart in 1991. For a moment, as a reminder, we have to return to what we discussed in the Earthshift primer. The yin-yang nature of the world of duality that we live in, and Russia is the great balancer. Russia has been performing the role of the great balancer for a very long time, basically from the very beginning of this earthly human civilization. But this is well outside the scope of this webinar, and I'm sure we'll discuss it in the future. Just keep in mind that the great balancer is Russia's embedded, karmic, and multidimensional role. It's Russia's destiny. That today's topic is the inverted collapse of the first half of the 21st century. To understand it, we actually have to go back and start at the beginning of the 20th century. And here, let me also remind you one more time, you heard this in the primer, but here's one more time. What is the yin-yang world of duality and how it works? This, for the incarnated third-dimensional world, yin-yang is a must. This is how balance is kept. It is this duality and this unity and constant struggle of the opposites, yin that is receptive and non-aggressive, nurturing, and yang that is aggressive, assertive, outgoing. Well, some people say light versus dark, yin being dark and yang being light, but not really, not quite. That's actually absolutely incorrect. The true light comes from the balance of yin and yang. I also reminded you that Russia is the only fully balanced yin-yang culture, or rather realm, existing in this world at this specific moment. And this is why Russia is tasked with being the great balancer, the balancing and stabilizing the rest of the world. Russia can lean on its yin side to repair its yang side, and vice versa. And this is the reason, this is the explanation for the mystery why Russia can repair herself so incredibly quickly, literally in the blink of time. How going from a total shambles, say what happened as a result of the revolution and the civil war in the beginning of the 20th century, to superpower, from being almost destroyed and 27 million people, dead during World War II, again going to a superpower that withstands the brunt of the attack from the entire West for years and years. Same happened in the 90s. Russia, almost a basket case, almost destroyed, almost non-existent, falling apart, and all experts are predicting that Russia will be disintegrating any moment now. And yet, look at Russia today. And that happened within a short scope of 10 years or less, Russia reversed the cycle so quickly that literally there is no other country on the planet that is able to accomplish something like that. This is an impossible feat, and it only can be explained why Russia rebuilds and rises from the ashes like that phoenix so quickly and so successfully and comes back stronger than before. It only can be explained multidimensionally. There is absolutely no way you can explain it if you look at it three-dimensionally, like the majority of people do, like the majority of those gurus and so-called experts do. This is why you have to listen to my multidimensional theory and fully understand it, in order to understand why the processes are happening in the world the way they actually do. So we are going for a moment back to the beginning of the 20th century and the Russian Revolution, Russian Civil War, and the formation of the Soviet Union in order to actually understand what is happening and what will be happening with the inverted collapse of the first half of the 21st century in the West. And we are starting with World War I and the real goals of that global war. Yes, on the surface, that's the 3D explanation. What was necessary, what the UK was after, was to destroy rivals on the continent. That's Germany that was rising, that was Austria-Hungary, and of course Russia, the three rivals. Three empires. Well, there was also Turkey, Ottoman Empire at the time, which was the side effect of that whole annihilation of empires that happened all over Europe, meaning that Ottoman Empire also occupied parts of Europe, so it could have been considered partially at least European power at the time. But the real multidimensional goal was actually to do away with Russia, the great balancer. And as I said, you have to understand that Russia played this role since forever. It was well beyond known history. The true history of the world was rewritten and screwed up many times over in the past 1,000 years. Especially in the past 400 years approximately. And so because of that, we actually don't know the true history of the world. I mean, I know, and some other people know or have suspicions of it, but the majority of people don't. Again, this is beyond the scope of this webinar, so we're not going to discuss it today, but stay tuned for more in the future. So back to World War I. So the most important goal was to try to do away with Russia, the great balancer. And why? Because UK at the time was the leader of we cannot say of the free world, but of the Western world, of the Western universe. And the Western universe was the yang side of the world. The yin side of the world was basically global south and global east. So it's Asia, the majority of Asia, except Japan perhaps, and whatever is in the south, which is Africa and South America for the most part. Of course, Australia, being in Southern Hemisphere, was always a colony and then the independent state as part of the Commonwealth of Great Britain, so it does not count. It still counts as part of the West. And so what we're having here is that bifurcation, that division between very aggressive and very assertive, very advancing on the rest of the world, wanted to absorb the rest of the world, yang West, and the East, that is so yin in fact, and South as well, including South America and Africa, so yin in fact that they're unable to fend for themselves. So they become colonized by the aggressive West. And only Russia, the great balancer, with its humongous territory in order to brace herself when balancing the rest of the world, spanning half of Asia and half of Europe. Only Russia was balancing all this. So doing away with Russia, the great balancer, or breaking it up or weakening it to the point that Russia cannot perform this role anymore, that was the UK's goal. That was the Great Britain's goal. Along with Great Britain, of course, we had France, and that was in cahoots with the Great Britain in the beginning of the 20th century, as well as the US. And the US at the time played second fiddle to the UK, where all the power was in fact concentrating. So we have these three powers basically trying to go against, basically epitomize the entire concept of the aggressive yang that wants to take over the entire world. And these three powers are trying desperately somehow to do away with not only competitors, but with the great balancer, which is the only thing that is in fact preventing them from capturing the rest of the world, which later we came to call NWO. And then Russia made some mistakes. Mistakes were made. Russia should not have entered into World War I. But to be sure, to be fair to Nicholas II, he tried to appease everyone. He tried to somehow broker a peace accord between Serbia, which was the reason Russia entered into World War I. The war was declared against Serbia by Austria-Hungary. Then Germany had to declare war together with Austria-Hungary. Basically, it was an agreement of mutual defense in case one of them gets attacked. It was an alliance, very, very close one. That's actually true. And as a result, of course, Russia had to step in because Russia had a similar accord with Serbia, Serbia being a close ally in the Balkans, as well as the country that upheld pravoslavные beliefs. Pravoslavные, you remember I discussed it in one of my articles. In fact, what is translated as Russian Orthodox Church is incorrect. It's called pravoslavные, the right believers, you could translate it more or less, the right believers. Well, that's the church, and that's what it's called in Russian, more or less. Keep in mind that World War I, the way we're discussing for the purposes of this webinar, it is not a geopolitical discussion. It is not about 3D minutiae of who wanted what and how the fighting went and who won what. The thing is that we have to keep in mind the main goal was to do away with the great balancer. And it was succeeding. This goal was succeeding. While Nicholas II struggled to somehow get into the peace territory, while Rasputin tried to convince Tsar through his influence, through his son and his wife, to exit the war, which is what would stop the destruction of Russia as the great balancer at the time. While all this was going on, and pacifist forces, which were represented by Rasputin, were trying to reverse the situation, at the very same time, UK, Great Britain at the time, and Germany. Keep in mind that here we're not discussing World War I as a geopolitical matter or as a minutia. There is a 3D minutia. Who did what? Who won what? Why such country attacked this country, etc., etc. We are not talking about it. We are talking about the multidimensional underlying reasons for the need to do away with the great balancer. If you recall history, Nicholas, first of all, tried to somehow end World War I. He tried to convince the parties not to enter it. Then he continuously tried to appease parties and convince them to stop World War I. Then Rasputin appears, and that happens around 1915 and then into 1916. He is the only pacifist force that is so influential that he tried to convince, through the emperors and through his son, Nicholas II, to exit the war. And he was actually succeeding. There was a lot of hesitation on the part of the emperor. And that's why Rasputin had to be killed. I talk about it a little bit in the Your Shifter, incidentally. So Rasputin had to be killed. That was what Rasputin was trying to do. And he was a cosmic soul that incarnated specifically to try and influence the outcome of the 20th century. If he succeeded and Russia exited the war, the chances are there would not have been a revolution. Russia would not be at the threat of annihilation. There might have not been civil war. There might have not been the 1917 revolution. But he gets killed. And so Nicholas stays in the war. And in 1917, we have two Russian revolutions. What is interesting is there are two revolutions in 1917, yet everybody talks about the Bolshevik Revolution, which happened on November 7th, 1917. Yet nobody talks about the so-called February Revolution. And the February Revolution, that was the true real color revolution? Here I'm actually answering some questions. Some readers submitted this kind of question. What really happened in 1917? What was that first February Revolution? And how to interpret the October Revolution, as it's called, which was November 7th, 1917, Bolshevik Revolution. And let me explain what all this meant. The first revolution was the interference by the UK, who were trying to destabilize Russia and who were trying to do away with emperor by destabilizing Russia, by introducing a revolution that annihilated the monarchy, and then introducing the force like the Bolsheviks and Lenin, that according to the plans of the British intelligence and the British crown were supposed to complete the destruction of Russia. By introducing and meshing all these forces together, they were hoping that Russia will be destroyed. And multidimensionally, that means they really desperately needed to do away with the great balancer so that nobody stands in their way. Germany at the time was losing the war, so they were pretty confident that a rival such as Germany will be in a very weakened position, which it was. And then there were these very brutal accords that sucked Germany dry. And unfortunately, that's what created this revenge of the Germans and restarted the cogs that led to World War II and Hitler coming to power. British are very smart. They would never invade Russia directly. They might use other proxies to do that, like they're using, like the US is using Ukraine right now to destabilize Russia, like Germany was used in 2 world wars to invade Russia. Silly Germans, in fact, that they succumbed to all this. And so British would not invade Russia, but what they wanted to do, which was a very well-known thing since Bismarck, who said that destabilization of Russia has to come from within. He said, Germans, do not ever invade Russia. Instead, destabilize Russia from within. When Russians in Ukraine start fighting Russians in Russia and stop believing that they're Russians, that's how we can take over Russia, and that's how we can weaken Russia. I'm not quoting, I'm just giving you the gist of what Bismarck said. So those dear German followers who know Bismarck by heart, please don't hold it against me. But that was the gist of what he was suggesting to Germans in 19th century. And he was a very, very smart guy. He is actually highly respected in Russia as someone who understood that Russia should not be attacked, and who actually left a testament to Germans to never attack Russia, which, of course, in the 20th century, they promptly forgot and tried to attack Russia twice. So what was happening, that the Brits were so smart, and yes, for those who, again, into the Jewish theme and the Zionist theme, yes, Jewish bankers were definitely against it and in cahoots with the Brits, but they were not the leading force. At most, they were equal partners, but my firm belief that Anglo-American world is at the pinnacle of the Yang aggressive developments, of the Yang aggressive point of the world that attacks others and that wants to take over the world and that wants to do away with the great balancer. I'm absolutely convinced of that. And Jewish bankers and the Zionists and whatnot, they are actually an attachment to that because it's convenient. They will change tax and they will swing to the other side in a second, in a jiff. The moment it becomes more lucrative for them and more profitable for them to deal with Russia and deal with China and India and deal with the East. And they incidentally are doing this already. This is why, that was another question I received. This is why US is experiencing so many difficulties with Israel at this point. Israel is rebelling against the US. Israel is trying to decouple from the US, get into a different tack. With EU, they already have a lot of problems. They're getting friendlier and friendlier to Russia. Yes, there are still a lot of problems, and these problems will be resolved very, very slowly, but they perceive Russia now more of an ally than they perceive the West, especially the EU. They have a lot of problems with the EU. And so don't think that Jews in general, or Jewish banksters, or Zionists, as some people refer to that, some people refer to this. And please do not confuse Jewish people with Zionists, because these are two different things. And not all the Jews are that way, that as American Zionists are. I mean, it's again, this is a separate discussion. There was an Earthshift report. It was ESR 6 about American Zionism. So please read up on that. You will get a full picture there, how all that took place and how it all started in the UK and partially in France as well, a little bit in Switzerland also. But primarily that was the UK project, or the Great Britain project rather. So we're going back to the two revolutions in 1917. The February Revolution was the color revolution orchestrated by the outside forces, paid for by the UK in order to destabilize Russia, and incidentally to make Russia stay in the war, because constantly there were attempts by Nicholas and other forces to exit the war, and the most reasonable people in Russia were actually suggesting that. But reason was leaving Russia at the time, unfortunately. The confusion reigned supreme, and this tells me that multidimensionally Russia had to go into a different mode. We can call it hiding, we can call it concealing Russia's light, perhaps. We can call it being in the darkness for a while in order to preserve yourself, preserve your essence. So the great balancer had to be preserved, but that could only happen if Russia stepped into the darkness for a bit, hid itself, hid its energy. And so when the February Revolution happened and destabilization began, then Lenin was bought and paid for by the British with the help of Germans. Germans wanted Russia's exit from World War I, and Lenin promised that, and he did achieve it. The British wanted him to finish destroying Russia, the great balancer, to create such a devastating war and division in society that nothing would survive past that. So again, the February Revolution was the capitalist revolution who came to power, where various royalty, incidentally, some of the cousins and relatives of the Emperor Nicholas II were wearing those red bands and proclaiming that the revolution is necessary, that abdication of the monarchy is necessary, and they were also manifesting, protesting together with the rest. Big capitalists of Russia, big land owners, big manufacturers, all they were against Nicholas, and they were for the abdication. Most of the army was for abdication, and so Nicholas was forced to abdicate the throne. He abdicated the throne in favor of his brother, who in turn refused to take the throne. Then it was republic after that, because there was nobody else to take the throne, because his son was too small and he was also very ill. And now we have a period between February, March, and the beginning of November. At that time, that's when Lenin stealthily crossed the entire Europe, from the UK or from Switzerland through Germany, then into Finland, and then from there on, Finland, incidentally, remember, it was part of the Russian Empire at the time, although a very loose part, into Finland, where he was hiding for a while, and then he comes into St. Petersburg, which is a very short ride from Finland. So he crosses the entire Europe, and that's when people say that the conspiracy was that he was in fact a German spy. He was not a German spy, I can assure you, and that was already proven by Nikolai Starikov and many other researchers. He was in fact the British spy. At least the British thought he was. Then the Germans allowed them through their territory upon agreement with the British intelligence. So both British and Germans were in cahoots on this. Now, imagine that was World War I. Germany and Britain were biggest enemies that the world ever had. They were killing each other on all fronts. They were in cahoots, letting pass through German territory the carriage, it was a train, and the carriage in which he and his cronies, his friends, were sealed in, it was a sealed carriage, was never opened anywhere. When the border crossing happens between countries, I ask you, does the customs open all carriages to see what's inside? So that sealed carriage going through the entire Europe, through warring zones, through armies fighting with each other, was never opened anywhere. In the midst of World War I, was let through all the way without anybody looking inside. So they get to St. Petersburg eventually. And again, he comes to the St. Petersburg station and he vows to create a Bolshevik revolution, a communist revolution, something that everybody in Russia, all these nobles that came to power after February Revolution, all these huge moguls and the capitalists and landowners, they came to power. They were holding the power at that moment. Lenin arrives to the main station of St. Petersburg, and everybody is greeting him with orchestra, huge crowd cheering for him. He gets this famous moment from history. He gets on top of the armored vehicle, which was somehow conveniently right next to the station, and says his famous speech, in which he called people on continue the revolution and start the Bolshevik revolution. And nobody arrests him. There's no army. Army is there in St. Petersburg, right there. No capitalist, no noble, those who are threatened by this, supposedly. Nobody arrests him, nobody comes near him. He is taken with cheers to his headquarters. And then they start plotting the revolution right there. So revolution happens. Smolny was the headquarters. Smolny, that's also famous historic fact, was an institute for the noble girls, the girls that were of noble descent and of high origins, and as well as super wealthy. That's where the headquarters was. It was in the middle, in the center of St. Petersburg. At the very same time, at the Winter Palace, which you know today as Hermitage, the so-called temporary government ruled by Kerensky was sitting and was trying to decide what to do next. Of course, they're all scared because the people and the army are on the side of Lenin. Well, nobody liked the temporary government. Nobody liked Kerensky. Nobody liked the rule of all those big moguls and capitalists and landowners. And that's clear. So the country is ready to take the revolution to the next stage, but also a lot of money was brought in. Lenin was supposed to be that secret weapon of the West, of the UK, in fact. Lenin said yes, took the money, promised everything there was to promise, that he will exit the war, that's to Germans, that's promise to Germans, that he will decouple certain territories, such as give freedom to Finland. Also, he then promised the Baltics, to make Baltics, which incidentally were never countries. Lithuania was a country, but Estonia and Latvia never were countries. They were acquired by the Russian emperor, that was Peter, I believe, Peter the Great, acquired them from Sweden when Sweden lost the war. Well, Swedish are still very traumatized, incidentally, losing to Peter, very beginning of 18th century. As a result of the loss in that war, Sweden stopped being an empire and reduced to nothing. So Russia acquired the Baltics, and they actually paid some money to them, good money, despite winning the war, as well as eventually to acquired Finland. And so at this point, we are having these promises. Yes, Lenin also mentioned, that is very important, that the Russian fleet will be sunk, so that it does not rival the British fleet. And you understand how important that point is, right? Because Britain fancied itself as the biggest sea superpower. didn't want any rivals. And the Russian fleet was not as strong because Russia constitutes a land superpower. According to geopolitics, powers are divided into sea and land powers. And it is a little outdated. I already discussed it in some other pieces of mine, but it still worked in the beginning of the 20th century. So that Russia doesn't have that power at seas that could rival the UK power, Lenin actually promised that Russian fleet will be sunk. And it was probably second in power to the UK fleet at the time. He actually fulfilled all those promises. He gave freedom to Finland and to the Baltics, which formed these quasi-little states, the three of them, which exist today as part of the EU, incidentally. He also sunk the fleet, which was a big loss for the country, of course. But it was done in a very specific way, and I will tell you in a second what Lenin has done. So the revolution happens, and then the Bolsheviks take power. And what starts happening next is, of course, first of all, is the civil war, which is very brutal. And the British and the French and the US participated in that as well, to slightly lesser degree perhaps, but mainly it was the British. They were arming both sides. They were giving money and arming and pitting against each other the Bolsheviks on one side and the whites. They were called Reds versus whites. That was how these forces fought amongst each other. The whites were either for restoration of the monarchy and Nicholas II, or they were for a capitalist republic. And on the other side, the Reds were for the communist future and the collectivist future of Russia. So when they were fighting, both sides were financed and oftentimes deliberately pitted against each other, such as one side would be provided weapons and another side would be deliberately disadvantaged. That was documented many times in history. And again, Nikolai Starikov, whom I mentioned previously, wrote books about this as well, in which he puts together the documents and proofs from very influential sources that give account of how it was. Incidentally, Russian author Bunin, a very famous Russian writer, Nobel Prize winner, he fought on the side of the whites during the Civil War of 1918-1920. And he wrote how, say, Great Britain was supposed to send the whites arms cash, like a whole shipment of arms that were arriving by ships. That they were trying to attack St. Petersburg to free it basically from the Bolsheviks. And what was happening at that time was that they are receiving this shipment, they're opening it, and instead of modern arms, they see sabers there and some medieval stuff that they cannot use, such as swords and various things that the people used in 10th, 12th century. And they open crate after crate, and all they have is this. Or they would open crates and they would see bullets that were of their own caliber that would not work with weapons that they were supposed to have. The rifles wouldn't shoot. Rifles would be damaged. And seriously, they paid in gold for all this. Actually, the real gold was spent on all that. And then when confronted with these problems, with this treachery, the British would say, oh, sorry, it's our workers at our factories. They're sabotaging our shipments. They're replacing good weapons with that. In other words, we have to believe that they have absolutely no supervision at their factories when they manufacture these arms, right? That workers in mass, like the entire shipment would be like this, okay? Ship after ship. Well, if we are supposed to believe this, well, maybe there was a little bit of that, a little bit of sabotage. I can see that, but the fact that they never caught on to that and replaced it back, or did something to warn that it's being delayed, or did something else honorable, it's impossible to fathom. That nobody ever caught on to that, and only when it arrived, then they, oh, sorry, mistake. Well, I think US operates today just like that. Instead of, oh, sorry, we bombed the civilians into oblivion in Iraq or in Syria. Oops, our bad. Mistake. Same there. But it was done deliberately. And the Russians came to believe that that's actually the truth. Well, so the Civil War ends, and then we begin the whole 20th century of the Soviet Union. Soviet Union was in fact formed in 1922. Now, this is very important to understand. Lenin promised all kinds of things to the Brits, and when he took their money and their support, he knew exactly what was happening and what Brits wanted him to do. They wanted him to destroy the country, to finish off Russia. Instead, Lenin, who was the shrewdest of the politicians that ever walked this globe, and probably the smartest, one of the smartest for sure, he took the money, said yes, 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 fulfilled certain promises such as sinking the fleet, which was 1918, giving freedom to Finland and the Baltics, and stopped at that. And then quietly, while he gave them this, like a hungry barking dog, you just throw them a few pieces of meat so they would let you pass. So meanwhile, while the dog is eating that meat and rejoicing, what you do is you quietly pass through. That's what he did. Basically, the Bolsheviks quietly, while they unfortunately had to fight the Civil War, and then they won the Civil War, and they quietly start rebuilding the country. In 1922, the Soviet Union is formed. And again, that was probably another concession he gave to certain forces that were difficult to control, both within the country and outside the country, such as the Brits. He formed the Soviet Union as a union of 15 republics, which incidentally was never the case. All of the territories of the Russian Empire existed as subjects of Russia. And suddenly we have all these semi-independent states, republics, like Ukraine, Belarus. Belarus never existed as a separate state. Ukraine, arguably, we can say there was Kiev and Rus, but that was Rus. That was still Russia, Rus. Certain other territories either joined Russia voluntarily, asking for protection from the Turks or from the Iranians. And those were, say, Georgia, Armenia. Azerbaijan was also part of the Persian Empire at one point and part of the Ottoman Empire, and it was more of a conquest. Certain Central Asian territories, Moldova was semi-absorbed and was semi-asked to join Russia, etc., etc. There was these kinds of instances. And so suddenly we have all these republics appearing. Not only that, also some territories which were the best, the most lucrative, the most developed territories were given to certain republics to boost them. Therefore, what we have with Ukraine right now, this disaster in Ukraine, in big part is because Lenin gave the developed and the most profitable south and east of today's Ukraine, just tore it away from Russia proper and gave it to Ukraine. They wanted to boost these republics so that each of them is that can sustain itself on its own. And basically what is happening later is that some of them it goes to their heads, most of them in fact, and they believe that territories that were torn from somebody else and given to them were in fact their own. Well, this is what we're observing with Ukraine. Later, there would be some other additions from the West, but that was always quid pro quo. For example, when Western Ukraine, which in fact was Ukraine, so it had the right to be a part of Ukraine, they spoke Ukrainian, even though it's a different Ukrainian, their mentality is different because they have been under Poles or under Austria-Hungary for centuries. When Western Ukraine was co-joined back towards Ukraine, what happened in exchange, Poland, for example, was given a very similar in value chunk of land from the Germany that lost World War II. So it was exchanged. There was an even exchange made. And of course, Germany, as the country that lost World War II, had to pay reparations, including in land. They owed reparations to Russia, big ones. And partially they had to be given to Russia as land. But Russia doesn't want all that land on the German side because it's separated by Poland, right? Russia only took what is today Kaliningrad, which is Eastern Prussia, which was at the time co-joined because it was next to Lithuania. And Kaliningrad, former Königsberg, today is an enclave sandwiched between Poland and Lithuania, which is a separate state today. So at the time, it was a part of, when after World War II, it was a part of the Soviet Union. It was had a border with it, Lithuania being part of the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, those parts of Germany that were offered to Russia as part of reparations that were separated by Poland, what was the point, right? There was no point at all. And so Russia offers Poland that section of Germany in exchange for Poland giving up Lvov and Western Ukraine. The Zakarpattia, Transcarpathia, which is the westernmost part of today's Western Ukraine, which is incidentally pro-Russian, unlike Lvov, which is Ukro-Nazi in nature. That section belonged to Hungary, but Hungary had to pay reparations too. Hungary lost the war because Hungarian government was in cahoots with Hitler, and therefore they had to pay reparations as well, smaller ones. So they had to give up that section of Western Ukraine, and it became a part of Russia. Well, again, history buffs among us will say, oh, but Russia entered those sections, those westernmost territories before the war. It was based on the pact with Hitler, Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Yes, and that's how World War I started. No, it did not start that way. It started when the West, namely UK and US, started pumping up Hitler and pushing him up to power, as well as pumping up German industry with credits, supplying them with technologies, with certain necessary things, giving them money, and that was the beginning of the 30s. And again, we are back to where we started. The thing is that the reason Hitler was pumped up, the reason he was groomed to be that next bully of the world who would attack everybody, they thought they could pull the strings and direct Hitler to the east, so he would attack Russia. Especially Hitler was really truly interested in 2 or 3 things in Russia. One of them were the fertile Chernozem lands in Ukraine. In fact, Germans who have pretty poor soils actually dreamt about acquiring certain land plots in Ukraine and building their farm there and becoming this agricultural superpower to the world, amongst other things. They were dreaming about it because lands are poor, soils are poor in Germany, generally speaking. And all these soldiers, they were promised these plots of land especially in Ukraine, in the conquered territories. And that's why they so happily went into the German army and participated in the genocide of the Russian people during World War II. There's really no way around it. The whole Germany was salivating over the Ukrainian lands, how they will take them away from Russians and they will be theirs going forward. Then they also wanted Caucasus. Caucasus they wanted for its oil, and also access to tremendous access in the Crimea, which is next to Caucasus, to the Black Sea ports and to the control of that whole territory. So they wanted Crimea, they wanted Caucasus, they wanted Ukraine. That was the biggest goal of that whole invasion on the economic 3D side. But the real multidimensional goal was to do away with Russia, to destroy Russia, to do away with the Great Balancer. As we know, that also didn't work out. Now, we also have to touch upon Stalin's repressions, but very, very briefly. Stalin's repressions, were they warranted? How many people really died? I'm just going to give you just a few stats. According to Nikolai Starikov, who is the foremost researcher on the subject, during the period between 1922, when Gulag first began as a result of the civil war. Remember, it was civil war with brutal confrontation between 2 opposing worldviews, reds and whites. Gulag began in 1922 approximately, and at that point, from there on, until the end of Gulag in 1954 or 56 approximately, don't remember the exact date, 645,000 people overall in that entire period were executed or died in Gulag. So the deaths overall between Gulag and executions of opposing opinions was 645,000. Of course, there were maybe a couple of million overall that went through Gulag during that entire period. It was never 20 million. Stalin never killed 20 million or 30 million or a billion. Some apparently are getting into billions right now with this hysteria. Stalin was no pussy, he was no angel, but Stalin was at the time necessary. And then now I want to tell you, this is one of the bombs I'm dropping on you, why exactly the Soviet Union was necessary and why such tough figures as Lenin and Stalin came to power. As I said, Lenin, the moment he was able to stabilize the country, he forgot all his extra promises or expectations the UK had of him to destroy Russia, and he started solidifying it. And then later on, when the country was actually secured, well, the British could not come near it. And then we had a lot of sabotage, a lot of spies being sent in. And of course, when that didn't work, then they began preparing World War II and Hitler to attack Russia and to try to again invade and do away with Russia that way. The Gulag has to be, and all these repressions, Stalin's repressions, also have to be taken in context of the times. Also remember how many people Hitler killed, how many people died in concentration camps under Hitler, in Germany, all over Europe. Also remember eugenics that were developing at approximately the same time in the 30s, I believe, in the US. Then remember the concentration camps for the Japanese in the US. It was a brutal time. It wasn't brutal just in Russia or the Soviet Union. It's not to justify Stalin, repressions, or anything else. Not at all. But this is to understand how all this fits together. Now, as far as why Stalin was necessary, I explained to you that if we needed to preserve the great balancer, the only way when everything was falling apart and the West became too strong and too many elites in Russia were so pro-West that they actually didn't mind selling out their country. I'm talking the beginning of the 20th century, World War I, and the Civil War. They didn't mind selling off their country like the whites. They were ready to sell off their country for the most part to the Brits. There are many instances when they swore allegiance to the Brits. One of the biggest leaders of the white movement, called Chuck, he became British citizen and swore allegiance to the British crown. Then he reversed it, and that's why he was actually killed. And the killing was instigated by the Brits. Their agents in Russia executed him during the Civil War. And there were other examples just like that. There were different examples of people who were actually so patriotic that they refused to succumb to pressure or be bought by the Brits. But many actually happily wanted to sell out their country. And many immigrants who were white immigrants later immigrated to various countries, primarily in Europe. And when Hitler came to power, some of them started working for him and betraying their country once more. Well, and I cannot condone any of that. I understand why people had to emigrate, because they held different views and there was no place for them in Russia, and then Soviet Union. I had in my own family people who did just that, who fought on the white side and who immigrated later. But there's a completely different story, just immigrating. And yeah, it was drudgery, unless you had a lot of money in the Swiss bank. But those who betrayed again, that's a different story. Those who worked for foreign intelligences against Russia, there are plenty of those who did that for Germans, for the Brits, for the Americans. Okay, so it was necessary. And one more time, the Great Balancer had to be saved. How to save the Great Balancer? Sometimes you had to plunge into the dark. Dive deep to conceal yourself underwater And yes, you're not breathing at that time. You're suffering. But maybe those who want to kill you, who are walking on the shore, trying to find where you dove into that river or into that sea, if you stay below the surface and suffer for a little bit, or swim under the surface without showing your face on the ground and emerge somewhere else, far away, then they won't kill you. They won't notice you. They probably will just walk away eventually. That's what the Soviet Union was doing. The Soviet Union began as the only way to save the Great Balancer. So Lenin and Stalin were busy saving the Great Balancer. They did what they had to do. Grow industry, yes. Collectivization, yes. And one of the absolute necessary things to save the Great Balancer was to create a system that was the opposite of the Western system, that was non-capitalist. That was the only way to secure the country, to mobilize the country. Mobilization economy, that's what was necessary. The Soviet Union fulfilled its role admirably. After World War II, the Soviet Union began turning into a real superpower, simultaneously with the US, the last man standing as a result of World War II. What we have now is the juxtaposition, the constant rivalry of two superpowers. And again, remember, it's the yin-yang world. So now we finally achieved the balance, true balance, that only happened as a result of World War II. So instead of doing away with the USSR, with Russia as the great balancer, World War II actually made it stronger. Which, if you look at it multidimensionally, you will see that actually everything was so designed, so conspired, like cosmic forces conspired to help USSR win the war. Almost single-handedly, with a slight help from the US. So now we have two superpowers, and they are almost equal, even though right after the war, USSR was devastated, absolutely destroyed. Of course, the headquarters of the Western world moved after World War II to the USA from the UK, which got weakened as a result of World War II, and we can call it karmic retribution, because they were conspiring against the rest of the world, against all kinds of competitors for so long. And so the UK started weakening gradually, but very quickly lost its empire, and the USA becomes this new pinnacle of the Western world. The two superpowers begin Cold War. And strangely enough, Cold War was the time of the biggest stretch of world peace that we can think of. Also, the colonial world that the West has created and has sucked dry for centuries starts disintegrating, and countries of Asia, South America, and Africa start becoming independent, one after another. Of course, India was a big blow, the biggest blow of all. And all that is possible only because of the USSR. USSR after World War II was extremely popular. Actually, everybody cheered for the USSR and wanted to be a friend of the USSR, especially countries that were not part of the so-called First World. And so the USA has to secure the West as much as possible. A lot of money is pumped into Europe to rebuild all the destruction. And it's called the Marshall Plan. Well, the USSR was doing exact same thing. It was pumping the money into all kinds of countries in Asia, such as China, incidentally, to help Vietnam, Cambodia, all those other countries, as well as the USSR had to rebuild this horrible destruction. And yet, very quickly, the USSR was rebuilt. And now we have this long period of relative stability in the world and some sort of mutual understanding that if anybody attacks anybody, that is going to be mutual annihilation. So let's somehow get along, even if we hate each other. And then we come to the 1985, big changes everywhere. And what we have, it appears that the USA won the competition. What really happened? Let me explain to you what it really meant. Again, we're back to the multidimensional world. The thing is that in 3D, in third dimension, which is fully physical, fully material dimensions, where everything is judged by what's in it for me, how much can I get from this? How much profit, for example? How big is my house? How happy am I with my wardrobe? How well am I eating? How rich is my country? Oh, see, GDP per capita in this country is higher than GDP per capita in that country. Yes, in 3D, that's how it looks. Therefore, this country is so much better. They have flashier cars in the West than in the Soviet Union. They have bigger houses there. People make more money, and they can afford a luxury hotel in California or in the Caribbean, whereas Russians have to go to Crimea or to Sochi for their vacations, and they live in small apartments. That's how it's measured in 3D. The world and life, our life, is only partially 3D. It is also the creativity, it is analysis, it is mind. But beyond that, there is also soul and spirit. There is consciousness. Nobody was looking at that side. And so visibly in 3D, of course, the USA won. How did they win? They sucked the rest of the world dry. They created petrodollar. Soviet Union could not compete with petrodollar. As Soviet Union succumbed, they misunderstood also. I mean, that's one of the downfalls of the Soviet system and generally socialist system. They actually are not very good at accounting. They overspend. They spend more than they take in. And they share. They also share. That's a very, very big characteristic of the socialist system in general. They share with their population. They give away money, they share with other countries, they try to pull everybody up. Meanwhile, what the aggressive West is doing and always has been doing, colonizing countries to suck them dry, new colonialism under the US in the second half of the 20th century was, we suck them dry, but not visibly. We don't necessarily invade them. Maybe we'll have bases there, but that's the most we will do. We actually enslave them economically and very, very subtly. So some of them don't even understand they're enslaved. And that's how USA and the Western Europe, with USA's help, of course, remember the Marshall Plan? That's how they started gaining momentum on the Soviet Union, who only had to rely on itself and had to shed assets all the time to feed the republics. Russia proper was shedding assets and shedding money and under-consuming to feed the republics. And in addition to that, all other countries that were poorer countries that they needed to sustain at a certain level. So the Soviet Union was in fact dragged by Russia, by the Russian Federation, and the rest of the world was dragged by Russia. And just to give you an idea, Russia was routinely, Russian citizens, per capita under-consuming and under-utilizing their resources because extra resources and extra money that Russian Federation gained went to feed Georgia. Georgia was the biggest consumer, I believe. Then there was Armenia. Armenia and Georgia were the biggest consumers, and Estonia. Then there was Latvia, then Ukraine, and the Central Asian republics, and then Moldova and Lithuania were somewhere in there as well. So the biggest suckers of wealth and resources and money were in fact Georgia, Armenia, and Estonia. Georgia and Estonia being the ones that are yelling and screaming, incidentally, that Russia sucked them dry and exploited them, etc. It was the other way around. And of course, the Russians were very displeased with that. Even Ukraine was over-consuming. Only Belarus was more or less on par with Russia. So Russia, primarily, and a little bit Belarus, fed the rest of the Soviet Union and the rest of the world, especially the third world. Of course, it was a very uneven battle. It's just like one person, say you have a duel, one person is wounded, so you fight in swords, right? One person is wounded and very, very subtly, very deliberately wounded, right, in a vital organ. And another one is fully healthy and sucking the life out of somebody else and feeding itself. Who do you think will win? So that's what happened. But beyond that, multidimensionally, we also have another reason for the USSR slowly dwindling in the 1980s and towards 1991. Actually, believe it or not, this is my bomb, the Soviet Union outlived its usefulness. We are entering, at that point, a new era. We were approaching the Earth shift. And the Earth shift, as I explained to you previously, has begun around the late 80s, possibly with 1985, Gorbachev coming to power. And then the perestroika and glasnost, all that, which was touted everywhere as great achievements of democracy, in fact led gradually to the Soviet Union falling apart, to the dissolution of the Soviet Union. So why did the Soviet Union outlive its usefulness? Because we are entering an absolutely new reality. We're supposed to make a leap into the future. Yes, on a 3D level, Russians got sick and tired of supporting the rest of the deadbeat republics and the rest of the Third World. But if we go deeper to 5D and beyond, the new system has to emerge. So the old system that was generated in the 20th century just to keep somehow the Great Balancer alive, to preserve the Great Balancer, yes, at a huge cost to the Russian people. But the cost would have been even higher if the Great Balancer had to die off, if the country completely fell apart and disintegrated in the beginning of the 20th century, or as a result of World War II, or if it was absorbed by the West. The cost would have been devastating to all of mankind if that were to happen. The mankind would have stopped to exist, actually. We would have the end of this human experiment as we know it. I wrote about it in the Earth Shifter. The Earth Shifter talks a little bit about the comet of karma coming to Earth and ending this human civilization. And this could have happened. Therefore, Gorbachev and Yeltsin were actually necessary evils, if you will. They had to facilitate the demise of the Soviet Union, the dismantling of the old system. They were basically the dismantling crew. And when the dismantling occurred, that was throughout the 1990s, when the task was complete, then the new person comes to power. This is the beginning of the new millennium. December 31st, 1999, at the stroke of midnight, Yeltsin suddenly announces that he is stepping down. Nobody expected that. Usually there is an address that goes out through the TV to all the citizens of Russia or Soviet Union in the past. When the leader of the country congratulates everybody with the new year, and as he said, Happy New Year, Happy New Millennium, Yeltsin said, and now I'm resigning as your president. I'm sorry for everything I've done wrong, for all the bad I did for Russia. That was not my intention. I'm fully sorry for that. And now I'm announcing that the new interim president of Russia will be Vladimir Putin. In March of 2000, there are elections in Russia, and Putin wins easily by a landslide. And the rest is history. Now we have the era of Putin, which, with some interruptions, there was Medvedev, who was part of the tandem, and now we have Putin again, and this era has lasted from the year 2000 until this year, 2017, and it will continue into the future. We can confidently say that Putin coming to power on the stroke of midnight of January 1st of 2000, the new millennium began, and he comes to power, is not a coincidence. It is a multidimensionally predetermined event. This was supposed to happen this way. It actually signals that the Earth shift is fully in operation. While the years between 1985, 1989, and 1999 were a preparation for the Earth shift. Now, Putin coming to power, Yeltsin stepping down, signals that we're on. We're completely on. And see how everything falls into place here once you understand the dates, the timing of the events. And so 17 years later, the new Russia is fully reborn. The Great Balancer is reborn. We have difficulties. We have things like Ukraine, Ukraine is used to keep Russia from fully fulfilling the role that Russia as the great balancer is supposed to fulfill. But it all also will be resolved. There is no way not to resolve it. It must be resolved. The only thing, those forces, they want to keep the old world, which benefited them, alive, they can only do some delaying. They cannot save what is supposed to go. The old world, the old Western way of life is supposed to collapse. And so the rebalancing that Russia, the great balancer, is tasked with has begun. It has been going on, but very slowly for a while, and it will continue going on. I will be talking about my predictions for the period 8 and a little bit for period 9 in the third webinar in this series, Earthshift Webinar 4. My predictions for period 8. In this episode, I will just say very quickly that the period 8 is the period of Russia. It is the period of the Northeast. Russia occupies the Northeast of the world. In part, it's also the period of China, also being more or less in the Northeast of the world. And this period is very beneficial for Russia, and this is why you actually are seeing Russia being in the headlines all the time for good and bad stuff, but also developing very quickly. And leaps and bounds, that's what we're seeing as far as the changes go. And Russia's operation and Putin's power is very strong right now. All this is because period 8 is aiding Russia in rebalancing the world and getting stronger as the great balancer. And I will talk all about it in the webinar 4, Lada period 8 predictions.